Hello, class. I'm going to talk about some material from chapters 1 through 12, just some oversights that can help you go through material for your first test, and some general information overall. Now, these first 12 chapters, it's a lot of material. And I know that you all might be a little bit confused over what you need to know the most about. The thing that I want, the main reason that you all were given this material for the first few weeks of class, even though the main focus of this class is the period after 1870, is that, Africa is literally the cradle of human beings. I mean, as far as we know, Homo sapiens begins in Africa. So Africa has the longest history and longest prehistory of any place in the world. And it really would not make sense to just start at 1870 as if that was a blank slate. It's not really possible. And so that's why I have you guys looking so far back. The first lecture I gave you, I talked about prehistory. I talked about iron production. But today I would like to talk a little bit more about Africa in general. Now, as I mentioned before, Africa is the second largest continent in the world. Africa has a size of a little bit over 11 million square miles, which is a little bit more than 3 times the size of the United States. The United States is 3.3 million square miles. And Africa's 11. So you could put America in there 3 times and then still have another 2/3 left over to add into it. So that gives you the size. For another perspective, Russia's about 6.8 million square miles. And so Russia, once again, is a little bit less than half the size of Africa. You could put all of Russia in Africa and then put in maybe another 40% of it. About another 45% of it. That would be the equivalent of Africa. So Africa is a really huge continent. Now, and the thing to understand about Africa is that there are some major features of Africa that affect the way it developed. First of all, Africa is the most tropical continent. If you look on the map, the equator runs through Africa. And also, and a big chunk of Africa is south of the equator. But also significantly, you have the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, the whole tropical area. About 80% of Africa is in the tropics. If you look at the southern border of North Africa, like southern Egypt, southern Libya, southern Algeria, they are all within the tropics, formerly within the tropics. And the tropic area, it doesn't end until you get into South Africa. So the great majority of Africa is within the tropics. And so this affects a number of things. I mean, first of all, because it's in the tropics, it affects what kind of crops grow there, how they move, how they're adopted. And also the fact that Africa is in the tropics also affects the way ocean currents and the climate, the way ocean currents in particular interact with Africa and affected the way people move in and out of Africa. Well, first of all, let's, since we've established that it's in the tropics, we need to break Africa down some more. You have the area of northern Africa, the modern day countries that are on the Mediterranean coast, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. Those countries historically had a great deal of interaction outside of Africa. And this makes sense because after all those countries I mentioned, they all border the Mediterranean. And to the east of the Mediterranean, you have the westernmost extremity of Asia. Now that being said, Asia and Europe are kind of artificial constructs. It's all one big piece of land. And so really the conception of Asia and Africa the conception of Asia and Europe really are more about cultural lines than actual geographic lines. But that's a discussion for another day. But anyway, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean goes up against, the modern day Middle East, the countries of Israel. You have the Gaza Strip. You have Lebanon. You have Syria. And to the north, you have Turkey. And then on the north of the Mediterranean, you have Europe, which once again, that would include a portion of Turkey. It includes the Balkan countries, modern day Serbia, Greece, Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, all those are countries on Baltic countries. Also, to the west of that, you have Italy. To the west of that, you have France, you have Spain. And so we see that North Africa, because of its proximity, there's always been that interaction. The ancient Greeks talk a lot about Egypt. Because literally, I remember when I went to Sudan for my graduate research, I'll never forget what a quick flight it was going from the Greek coast of the Mediterranean to Egypt. It was like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, something. It was a very quick flight, to get from the northern coast of the Mediterranean to the southern coast. And so that interaction has always been there. Now, once you get into North Africa, of course, the defining feature of modern North Africa is the Sahara. And the Sahara, is adapted from the Arabic word Sahara, which simply means desert. And the Sahara now is the biggest desert in the world. Now, the thing to remember that the Sahara is actually a very young geographic feature. The Sahara is largely a product of the last 11,000 or so years, at the end of the Ice Age. As the Ice Age ended, the Sahara dried out. Prior to that, the Sahara had been an area with a lot of water, a lot of lakes. If you look in your book, in some of the chapters, they have pictures of the animals that used to be in the Sahara. Used to have, large herds of elephants and antelopes and giraffes, all these other creatures that nowadays we think of being further south in Africa. And you still see some small populations of them on the southern edges of the Sahara. But there was a time that entire area was a wet area with lots of grassland, lots of lakes, and lots of people living there. And so one of the interesting things about the growth of the Sahara is that it really became a significant dividing line. It's not an accident that on the northern edge of the Sahara, the people on the northern edge of the Sahara, by and large, are what we nowadays would call white. Now, I know a lot of people might have problems with that. They would look at some of the peoples that have been found in ancient Egypt, or they might point to populations in places like Morocco and say, a lot of these people are pretty dark. But to a certain degree, modern populations that we see that are kind of dark in these areas is kind of a byproduct of, people moving back across the desert. But basically, the Sahara really kind of split Africa, divided Africa, in that you tended to have fair complected people to the north, darker complected people to the south. And this is significant because, once again, if we look at the period before the desert developed in what now is the Sahara, and you look at the rock art paintings, you can see paintings of a lot of people who look a lot like sub-Saharan Africans who live right in the heart of what now is the desert. And you still do have some small populations of blacks who live in the desert areas, especially around the oases. Now, this brings us to an interesting thing, because Egypt, is really the first really, really big world-recognized civilization that comes out of Africa, that's African. And as the Greek historian Herodotus said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. You know, if you ever look at if you all want to look at a satellite map of Egypt, and you'll see that you have this little thin strip of green that is right along the Sahara. And once you get past that, it's all brown. I mean, I remember the time I went through Egypt. I landed at the airport in Cairo. And I literally, if I looked to one side, I saw palm trees, I saw, flowers and everything. I literally looked to the other side of the airport, it's desert sands blowing, because everything was right along the Nile. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, going back almost 20,000 years ago, you could see where people began to settle along the Nile. In what nowadays would be Upper Egypt, because Upper Egypt is the southern part of Egypt. Lower Egypt is the northern part of Egypt. Now, the reason that says that the Nile is, unlike most rivers, the Nile runs from the south to the north. And the reason it runs from the south to the north is that in East Africa, where the Nile has its origins, is a place of very, very high elevation. And so, therefore, this means that although the water's going from south to north, it's running downhill the whole time. And eventually, the Nile has its outlet into the Mediterranean. And so what we see is that, you had populations, coming from the south into the north. But also because Egypt had a land border with Asia, the area of the Sinai Peninsula. There was also movement of people from Eurasia into Egypt. And so, this gets us to one of the big controversies about in African history is what color were the ancient Egyptians? And, my opinion might seem, from what I've seen, my opinion might not be the one that a lot of people imagine nowadays. But as far as I can, from what I've seen of the evidence, in ancient Egypt, there was always a very significant element of the population that came out of Africa. Now, that came from outside of Africa. Now, obviously, you had a Black African component in Egypt. That was always there. I mean, if you look at modern day Upper Egypt, the indigenous population there are the Nubians, who are Black Africans. And it's pretty clear that there was always movement to one degree or another from the south to the north. But from what I can see, there was always a pretty significant of people coming from Eurasia into Egypt. And also, as far as we know, I mean, this is one of these things we don't really know about. People that we consider white nowadays might well, a lot of the quote unquote white Egyptians might well have been of African origin. Because the thing about it is that one of the things that genetics has shown us that is that how people look on the outside does not always indicate their genetic relationship. I mean, people might look quote unquote white or might look quote unquote black and might be genetically more closely related to people who don't quite look like them. And so, that's one of those things that, scientists are still going to be studying. But the bottom line with Egypt is that Egypt was an area that was able to take advantage of the regular floodwaters that came up through the Nile. Basically during the summertime, the Nile starts flooding and water starts going north, and people could reliably plant their crops there. And this allowed for a stable, developing civilization. And Egypt, as we know it, really became a formal empire around about 3100 BC when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified. Now, Egyptian culture is very significant because it has a lot of influence around surrounding areas. I mean, if you go towards Europe, the island of Crete, those people if you look at their culture, if you look at the religious iconography that they left behind, were clearly influenced by Egypt. And also to the south into what nowadays is Sudan. If you look at the kingdoms of Kush, you look at the kingdoms of Merowe, like, because I mentioned Kush and Merowe earlier as sites of early iron production. These people culturally were very heavily influenced by Egypt. As a matter of fact, one of the dynasties of Egypt, the 25th dynasty, was actually came out of Kush. These were people who ruled the area. Now, if we look at other civilizations in northern Africa, of course, we look at the Carthaginian civilization. The Carthaginians were related to the Phoenicians. I mean, they spoke the same language. The Phoenicians were people from from what is now modern day Lebanon. And of course, they were very significant for the war they fought for the Punic Wars. But Punic was the Latin term for Phoenician. Those were the wars that were fought that during the time of the Roman Republic between Carthage and Rome. The Romans eventually won. Now, outside of Egypt, if we go back into the desert again, it's really significant that there were people who moved between the desert and the interior. Now, this was something that developed over time, and what happened is that people who lived in the interior, because they lived there, as the area became more and more desert, over time, they had developed certain safe routes that they could take to the south. The desert was a place that you couldn't really go if you didn't know where you were going, because if you went to the wrong place, you would run out of water and you'd die. But if you were somebody who had connections there, and then you knew what would be the safest routes to take, and you knew how long you could get there safely. And so that meant that there was always a movement of people back and forth. Now, this was problematic for a long time, because it's really not until about 2,000 years ago that you begin to see camels showing up in Africa, because the camel is not indigenous to Africa. Camels come from Asia. The dromedary camel, the one-hump camel that we see in Africa nowadays, it was domesticated in Asia. The other camel, the Bactrian camel that has two humps, that's a shaggier, it's kind of more of a cold weather camel. And you see that in Central and Eastern Asia, Northern, Central, and Eastern Asia. But like I said, once the camel comes in, this becomes a revolutionary thing that allows people to move from north to south more easily. Now, I'm going to skip a lot of time here because, ancient Egypt basically ceases to be a separate culture, around about 400 AD. You have it, Egypt is an independent country from about 3100 BC, really until about the time of Cleopatra, although Cleopatra herself was not technically Egyptian. I mean, she was part of the Ptolemaic dynasties of people of Greek descent who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great came and conquered the area in the 4th century BC. Now, in addition to Egypt, you had the territories of the Horn of Africa. The oldest of the kingdoms of, outside of the kingdoms that existed along the Nile. And like I said, those are the kingdoms of Kush, Merowe, Nubia. On the Red Sea, you had the kingdom of Axum. Now, the area of the Horn of Africa is interesting because a number of people in the Horn of Africa speak Semitic languages. In the modern day countries of Eritrea and Ethiopia, you have people who speak Semitic languages. These are languages that are part of the Afro-Asiatic family of languages, and they are related to Semitic languages that are spoken in in the Middle East. The languages of Arabic, the languages of Aramaic, which was the language that was spoken by Jesus when during his time. Hebrew, which is the language of modern day Israel. And there were a number of other Semitic languages that were spoken in that area. Well, from what we can see is that once again you had a significant movement of people from Arabia, what nowadays is Arabia, into the Horn of Africa, and going back about 4,000 years ago. So around about 2,000, 2,500 BC, there began to be a significant movement of immigrants into Africa from the Middle East, and these people intermarried with local African populations, and this pretty much gave rise to modern day Horn of African populations. If the people of modern day Ethiopia, people of modern day Eritrea, people of modern day Somalia, people of modern day Djibouti, and also minority populations in modern day Kenya. Now, this would also include people of Sudan. You had people from the Middle East moved into Sudan, although in Sudan you also had the additional factor of Arabic-speaking people who moved into the area over time. A later movement of Semitic people who moved into the area. And so what we see with the Horn of Africa, going back to Axum, most famously, the king of Axum, King Ezana, in the year 320, converted to Christianity after he had been preached to by missionaries from what nowadays is Syria. And so culturally, you have this connection between the Horn of Africa and the Middle East. Now, going further south and east of Africa, you eventually run into the area of what's known as the Swahili Coast. The Swahili Coast basically goes from the southern coast of modern-day Somalia down to the border with Tanzania and Mozambique. Now, this area is significant because of something that I talked about earlier. Remember, I said that one of the distinguishing characteristics of Africa is that Africa is the world's most tropical continent. Now, on the Swahili Coast, this is significant because this part of Africa was dominated by what's known as the monsoon. The monsoon is a seasonal wind pattern. That means that, during the springtime, the wind blows out from the east, from the west to the east. And in the fall, it blew from the east to the west. What this meant was that people could build ships, and the most common type of ship built in that area was the dhow. You have pictures of them in your book. You spell it DHOW. These were ships, single sail ships that were used to move back and forth from Asia to Africa. And you have the development of what becomes known as the Swahili community that develops over time and really starts to pick up, in the period from about 1,000 until about 1,500. I mean, they go back further. I mean, you hear people, as far back as a book known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. But Periplus basically means kind of a ship's manual. This was a book written by an ethnic Greek person, or at least it was written in Greek, that was written, during the Roman Empire period, that describes, sailing along the Red Sea and into the northern part of the Swahili Coast. And so the point to be made is that you had people who regularly moved back and forth on this coast for several thousand years. And this developed a significant trade route. And this is significant because you had goods leaving Africa. Like, for instance, Africa was a great source of hardwoods that were desirable for building. Africa, had exotic products, like animal skins and other kinds of things. Also, Africa was a source of gold. And Africans wanted things from Eurasia. They got certain valuable items, certain kind of manufactured goods, that kind of thing. And also, one of the things that really is significant that's going to be important to talk about in later periods is the existence of the slave trade. Africa, pretty early on, becomes a significant area of slave trading. Now, the reasons for this are pretty straightforward. By and large, parts of the world where people bought slaves tended to be places where you had small-scale political units, or maybe stateless societies. I mean, like for instance, in eastern Nigeria, on the other side of the African continent, several thousand or so years later, eastern Nigeria would be a major place to get slaves because people there did not have kings or large scale political units. And that meant it was easier for outsiders to come in and negotiate with people and get folks, or it meant it was easier for political units from neighboring areas to raid and get people because the people were not organized in a way that allowed them to respond effectively. And so the slave trade becomes a significant aspect of the Swahili economy. Over time, a demand for slaves develops in what nowadays is Iraq and Arabia, in Iran. And there's also a demand for slaves in the Indian subcontinent. I mean, if you look at modern day India, you have a significant population of black people known as the cities that are descendants of those people. And, in Iraq and Iran and a lot of these other countries, you still have minority populations of people of African descent, a number of whom can trace their origins back to the movement of people. But the one thing I really would like to stress is that these earlier slave trades tended not to be as racialized as the slave trade that would develop in the early modern period. Now, similarly, we see that across the Sahara, as I said before, the development of the camel, people are able to move across the desert. And we see the development of societies that are based on trade in West Africa. The earliest of these is Ghana. Ancient Ghana is not the same as the Ghana you see on the map. The Ghana you see on the map nowadays is a lot further south than ancient Ghana. Ancient Ghana was pretty much in the area of what we would nowadays call Mauritania. And what we see is that, from the period from about 300 of the Common Era until about 1600 or so of the Common Era, you have a number of kingdoms that develop in the area, going back as far east as Chad to the west coast of Africa. And one of the things that the major thing that all these kingdoms had in common was that they were regularly engaged in trade with the North. And like I said, this is where the camel comes in. Now, the people in Western Africa had a number of items that were of use. One of the interesting things is that they dealt in was the cola nut. Now, the cola nut was particularly useful for people who traveled the desert because if people took cola nut in Africa basically for the same reason that Indians in South America chewed the coca leaf. Both of those were stimulants that allow people to go longer without water and with less food. And if you're traveling in harsh environments, the desert in Africa, oh, excuse me, sorry about that, or the Andes Mountains in South America, stimulants that allowed you not to have to drink so much water and not to have to eat so much were very useful for travelers. And so the kola nut was very valuable. Uh, in addition to the kola nut, one of the major sources of revenue for West Africa was gold. Now, the interesting thing is that the people in the savannah, the people in these kingdoms of the Sudan, and like I said, the term that was used in Western Africa was the Sudan. And this might be confusing because, you know, the modern day country of Sudan is in the Horn of Africa. But basically, the term Sudan itself comes from the term Suda Aswad in Arabic, and that means black. And the Arabs, as they started to come into the area, they referred to the area south of the desert as Balada Sudan, which meant the land of black people. And so whenever you see the term Sudan in Africa, that's a reference to the fact that the people who live in that area are people that folks outside of the area considered to be black people. And like I said, the Western Sudan was an area that provided gold. It provided a number of other things too. Like, for instance, over time, it became an area of significant leather working. You know, a lot of times what people nowadays refer to as Moroccan leather was leather those leather techniques originally came from what nowadays would be Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. You know, these areas in Western Africa. Now, people in Western Africa, the things that they imported from the north, one of the bigger things that they imported from the north were horses. Now, this is significant because the Sudan area was wide open, a lot of wide spaces, and horses were really useful for rulers for extending military power. If you had access to horses, you could control a lot of territory. Now, horses tended to be less useful the further south you went into Africa because as you got further south in Africa, horses ran into more and more diseases that affected them, especially the big horses that military people want. Because, you know, military folks, they wanted big, strong horses that could carry soldiers who were in armor and who were carrying weapons. And one of the things about Africa is that smaller animals tended to, you know, smaller domestic animals, you know, like smaller horses, smaller cows, they tended to develop the antibodies that allowed them to handle African disease. Big horses tended not to last very long in Africa. You know, a lot of times there were certain diseases that they could catch that would block their bladders, and, you know, the horses would eventually swell up and, you know, not be able to urinate. And, you know, of course, you know, not being able to urinate, you know, is a deadly situation. That will eventually kill you. And so this meant that there was always a steady market for horses in these kingdoms. And like I said, you know, the kingdoms, you know, go in succession. The first kingdom is Ghana. The second kingdom is Mali. The third kingdom is, oh my goodness, I'm having a blank here for a minute. Oh my goodness, I can't remember the name of the third kingdom. Oh my goodness, now as long as I've been doing this, I ought to know this by heart. Let me take a peek back here for a second because I cannot remember. Oh man. Yeah, Songhai. Like I said, as long as I've been doing this, that's the first time I ever forgot the name of Songhai. But like I said, the first kingdom was Ghana, which, you know, basically goes from about 300 until about 1040 or so. Then you have Mali coming up which lasts about 200 or so years. And then you have Songhai as the last of these kingdoms, which lasts until the middle part of the 16th century. Now, one of the interesting dynamics is that the kingdoms of the Western Sudan regularly did business with folks in the north. You know, people would come down through a couple of trails. You had one trail that went through the mountains of Ayer in what is now modern day Niger, going into the Sudan. You had people, now further to the east, you had people going through what nowadays is Libya down to Kanem Bornu, in what nowadays would be modern day Chad and eastern Nigeria, as well as Niger. And then you also had people taking the western route through Morocco, going through what nowadays would be Spanish Sahara, Mauritania, into what would be modern day Mali and Senegal and modern day Mauritania, because those were the areas where people did business. Now, one of the things that you all will see is that there was always political tension between these two areas. Like, for instance, one of the things that kind of helped undo Ghana, in addition to simply environmental change, was military pressure from Morocco in the form of the movement known as the Almoravids, or if you want to use the proper Arabic term, the Almorabatun, who responded to military movement from the Ghanaians into the southern part of what they considered their territory. And, they were eventually able to overwhelm the Kingdom of Ghana. Then eventually, you have the emergence of Mali, which emerges, in the 11th century, going into the 14th century. And then after the collapse of Mali, further to the east, you have Songhai. And so in this case, we see that the relationship between West Africa and North Africa was complicated. There was a trade relationship, but there was also military rivalry and military competition. Now, as I said before, West Africa had articles that were valuable like gold, and they wanted stuff from the north like horses. But also the slave trade was a factor in West Africa too. Once again, people in Northern Africa wanted labor. And what you see is that kingdoms in West Africa attacked their weaker neighbors and sold those people into slavery. And so, for instance, in a place like modern-day Morocco, you have a very large population of black and mixed race Moroccans, largely as a result of the slave trade. Those populations are a smaller number in Algeria, but they exist. And, Tunisia, for instance, actually has a pretty significant black minority of about 15% of the population. I imagine a significant proportion of them can trace their ancestry back to this movement of people. Now, the final area that I want to talk about in terms of these older kingdoms in Africa is Southern Africa. You have the kingdom of Monomotapa, and then you have Great Zimbabwe. These were kingdoms that developed, they were south of the Swahili Coast. But you had traders who moved into the interior. And these people did business with folks on the Swahili Coast, and indirectly, at first at least, over time with the Portuguese who started coming to that area in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Now, one of the things that's significant about Africa is that, not all of these societies had written records. Now, Egypt, of course, had written records. We see written records that were developed, for instance, in the areas of modern-day Sudan. Those areas, like I said, Nubia, Kush, Merowe. Now, the interesting thing about, we cannot read most Meroitic writing. I mean, there's a little bit we can read, like, the names of rulers and that kind of stuff, but most of it has never been, has not been deciphered yet. Now, in the Horn of Africa, they use an alphabet that's still used by modern Ethiopians and Eritreans. And so therefore, the ancient language of that area, Ge'ez, we can read that language. That's a language that can be translated. Now, in West Africa, we see that really prior to Islam, you don't really have a widespread functioning written languages. And so what happens is that once Islam starts coming into these areas, a lot of these people very quickly adopt the Arabic alphabet. And some people write in Arabic. Other people take the Arabic script and write their own local language into it. And so either way, you begin to see the development of written language. Now, some people who did not have written language, like, for instance, particularly in Mali, They did not have a written language, but they had what was known as the griot. These were professional poets who memorized history. They memorized lineages of kings, and they performed that. They performed that history through music, because because if you make it poetry and if you make it music, it's easier for people to remember. This is something that also was very common in Somalia, where Somali was not a written language until the 20th century. And so therefore, the people of Somalia had a very, very strong tradition of poetry that allowed them to memorize a lot of information. Now, this is something that, Africans weren't the only people to do this. I mean, for instance, the ancient Greeks, for instance, like the Odysseys of Homer. Homer couldn't write, but he was a poet. He memorized these songs and performed them. And eventually, once the Greeks developed an alphabet, because the Greeks, they didn't invent their alphabet. They got the alphabet from the Middle East, basically from Phoenicia, the same people who would eventually become the Carthaginians in Tunisia. And they were able to pick up that alphabet. And then they adopted it to their language. And the Romans eventually adopted the Greek alphabet. And so that's another thing to understand, too, is that alphabet was something that wasn't invented multiple times. But it was pretty much invented once or twice. And other people adopted it as they came into contact with it. So therefore, the fact that Africans, by and large, didn't invent written languages outside of Egypt, it doesn't mean the Africans were inferior. I mean, Europeans didn't invent a written language. Their written language came out of the Middle East. Asia did not invent, like, for instance, East Asia, they didn't invent an alphabet. I mean, Chinese is not an alphabetic language. It's a that's why they have so many symbols in their language, because it's based on symbols as opposed to an alphabet. And so this is one of the things to learn. But the lack of an alphabet also brings up the fact that there's a lot of African history that we have to infer indirectly, either through oral history or else, looking at archaeology and, things of that nature. And so, that's just something to take in consideration when looking at African history. Well, anyway, class, that's going to be it. This is a pretty long lecture, but I just wanted to get that to you guys so you could help you with some of the questions that you have. Take care.